Good afternoon. Welcome to the international session. Thanks so much for coming. I'm David Goralnik from Kaleidoscope Learning in New York and also Columbia University and the International E-Learning Association. So I will be chairing this afternoon session and also speaking during this afternoon session. So playing a couple of different roles and closing it with a discussion, so you'll see a lot of me. And I'm ready to just get right to it. I'm really delighted to have all of our speakers here, and particularly our first talk, which is Charles Jennings and Lynne Cooper. Charles is a leading thinker and practitioner in innovative talent, learning, and performance approaches. He's an author and well-known speaker. You may well have heard of him. He's particularly known for his work on the 70-20-10 model, which Charles and Lynne will discuss today. His career includes roles as a business school professor, as the head of the UK National Centre for Network Learning, chief learning officer for global companies, a consultant, member of advisory boards for learning, performance, and business bodies. So many things that I could tell you about. He's a fellow of the UK Royal Society for the Arts, a fellow of the Learning and Performance Institute, senior advisor at the European Foundation for Management Development and other bodies, and there's probably more and more I could tell you about that. He's also the co-founder of the 70-20-10 Institute, and Lynne is the Directrice pédagogique at 7 Speaking. So we're delighted to have both Charles Jennings and Lynne Cooper, so let's please welcome them to talk about the 70-20-10 framework, from learning value to business value. Let's welcome Charles and Lynne.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for a very nice introduction. So we'll skip the introduction, as you did a brilliant job on that. And I think you forgot a few things about Charles, but I think he might forgive you. Okay, so today we're going to talk about 70-20-10. I think that's one of the purposes why you came. We're also going to talk about what we learn, what's the business value of learning, and I think this is the key point of our presentation, is not just talking about learning for learning's sake, but talking about what impact it actually has on your organizations. And how does this apply, of course, to language learning, which is my specialty with 7 Speaking. Okay? So I'm just going to hand you the microphone.
Thank you very much, Lynne. Thank you. So basically what we want to do in this session is, as Lynne said, we want to cover all those issues around 70-20-10, but really focusing on what can be gained by increasing language competencies, what can be gained by improving fluency in business, how can we think about the learning and the link between the learning and performance. And that's really key in terms of what we need to do. So can I have the... Yes. Do a little bit of transfer here. Can you hear me now still? Okay, great. So first of all, I'd just like to... Can you hear me? Yep, okay. Talk about what 70-20-10 is. And a lot of people have misconceptions about this framework, and it is just a framework, it's a reference model. And what 70-20-10 says is that when we look at learning in a systemic or a holistic way, it consists of a number of elements. Of course, we learn through formal, structured learning, the 10, where we look through formal and structured learning with a teacher or with a surrogate teacher. We learn through maybe an e-learning program or all sorts of different formal approaches. But we also learn a lot through and with other people. We learn through conversations. We learn through deep and meaningful engagement with other people. We learn from getting advice and guidance from our colleagues, from our managers, from people who report to us. That's the 20 part of the 70-20-10 model. And the 70 part is all the learning that occurs through working as part of the workplace. And I'll go into some detail in a little while to give you some numbers around this. But that 70 and that 20 are really, really important. Don't think of them as just as percentages. Don't think of them that way, but think of them in terms of they're important in terms of linking to the 10, and we need a bit of all if we're going to be really effective. So that's what the model is. If I can move to the
So we're
next.
sort of giving you a practical example of what 70-20-10 is. And this example we draw on wine and wine tasting. And we thought about this because, of course, we're in France, but also Charles is from Australia, which is a big wine country too. And if you think about 70-20-10 in wine tasting and in enjoying wine and in knowing about wine, you can think about 10 as reading about it, okay? You have the information about it, you go on websites, you read labels, you have the apps now, you can have all of this information, okay? The 20 would be talking about wine. And you know how passionate people can get talking about wine. There was actually François-Xavier de Maison who just ended a theatre piece, which is called Divin, which talks about 10 wines that shaped his experience, okay? So that's part of the conversations, that's part of the exchanges, and of course the 70, which are the most important and also the most enjoyable, if you like wine, is the fact of drinking it, okay? Enjoying it, having the pleasure, having the experience, and smelling it, spitting it out. But this is what 70-20-10 is in a practical example, okay?
Just extending that metaphor a little more, you can see on the slide there in the middle, there's a bottle of wine. Now, that's a wine called a Grange Hermitage, produced by an Australian winemaker called Penfolds. That is the top, or one of the very top wines made in Australia. And one lesson I learned when I was very young, when I turned 21, I was given a case of this wine. Now, if you went out to buy a bottle of this wine today, it would start at about 500 euros a bottle and go upwards from that, okay? I was given a case of this when I was 21 years old. By the time I had my 22nd birthday, I had none left. I drunk the lot. So that was the experience without the learning, without the 10 and without the 20. The experience was great, but I didn't learn a great deal from it, from that experience. So there we go.
But you had a nice time.
Yeah, had a great time, absolutely. It was wonderful, yeah. But yeah, didn't learn a great deal from that. So let's look at some of the key principles around this framework, around this model. And the first one is that most learning actually occurs in the daily flow of work. Most learning occurs in the workplace. And some research carried out by a group of economists at the European Centre for Education and the Labour Market, based in the Netherlands. They've analysed how much time people spend learning during their working time. And they estimate that around about, as you can see, around about 96% of the learning time is actually whilst we are working. About 4% of the learning time is actually when we're away from work. In other words, when we're completing an e-learning module or involved in a class or a training. It's not to say it's not important, it's just simply that there's a lot less time that we spend learning, and this 96% of time is a huge opportunity for us to think about how we can extend learning into that. And the background of this is that if you think of the amount of formal hours that people in your organizations or organizations you work with, the amount of formal hours that people spend learning, and the Association for Talent Development, the ATD, publishes its annual State of the Industry, and it estimates that their best companies, the companies that are really, really focused on learning, maybe people in those organizations spend about 50 hours per year learning. When they analyze all the companies that submit data to ATD, it's around about 35 hours a year. And that hasn't changed much in the last decade. It's gone up and down a little bit, but it hasn't changed very much at all. So then if you think so, just assume that we're all good companies, and we spend 50 hours a year, our people spend 50 hours a year formal learning. How much time do we spend working? Well, the figures are there for you. If you look here at, in France, 2020, the average time that people actually spend working is around about 1,400, well, exactly 1,402 hours is in France. The OECD standard, the average in the OECD is 1687. It varies from country to country. If you look at the United States, it's quite a lot more, it's about 1,800. If you look at other countries like the Netherlands, it's actually less. So you don't have to be a mathematician to realize that if you're working 1,400 hours a year and your formal learning is 50 hours a year, that's where we get this figure of around about 4% or so. Now actually the Centre for Education and the Labour Market has also looked at the opportunities for learning whilst we're working. And surprisingly, if you work as in what they call white collar or manual, blue collar or manual work, if you're working with your hands, the opportunities for learning average about 20% of the time that you're working provide opportunities for learning. So you might be a motor mechanic, or you could be working as a plumber, or you could be working in a factory. About 20% of the time is an opportunity to learn. Yet knowledge workers, people working with their heads and so on, about 25%. So there's not much difference. So if you take 25% of your working hours, of your 1,400 hours, and think about the difference between that and the time that we spend formally learning, the 70-20-10 approach focuses on how can we extend that learning and those opportunities and really exploit those into the workplace. The second principle of 70-20-10 is that the best learning often occurs close to the point of use. Now this goes back 121 years to these two gentlemen, American psychologists, who carried out some research and published their principle of identical elements in 1901. And one of them was the president of the American Psychological Association, and their principle was that the more elements in the environment where you learn to do something are similar to the environment where you're going to use that learning, the more effective that learning will be. In other words, we all know the issues about transfer. And how do we transfer training out of the classroom or away from the learning environment into the workplace environment? So these two gentlemen identified 120 years ago that the answer to that is you bring learning close to the working place. So the closer they are, the transfer issue essentially goes away or becomes very much more limited. And so we're starting to see this in our formal learning. We're starting to see what is often called micro-learning. I call it micro-training, but micro-learning, so we can get access to nuggets of learning in the workplace. We've seen it with things like, in the consumer market, we've seen things like YouTube. I want to know how to empty the filter in my washing machine. What do? I go to YouTube, I find the model of my washing machine, I look at a little video and I can do it. I might have to do that because I don't clean the filter in my washing machine, I'm afraid, very often. I might have to do it a few times, but after a while, I'll know what to do. So that learning's been carried out in the workplace. So that second principle is really critical. And also, this research, this 1901 research has been replicated many times. And IBM did some work on this about 15 years ago now and showed that the realized value for our organizations, in other words, the business value for our organizations, is more value is created the closer to the point of use that learning occurs. In other words, when we integrate learning into the workflow, we can create more value. So when we think about this in the context of 70-20-10, we think that when we're looking at really creating value, the 10 is critical. That builds the bedrock. That gets us established. That builds our basic competencies. But if we want to develop those basic competencies, we need to focus on learning as part of working. So the 20 and the 70 are critical, and that's absolutely that's vital. And the third principle also is focused around, if that learning in the workplace is so important, how is that managed? How do we make sure that happens? How is that supported? And the answer is, people like us who are involved in learning and development don't have a great deal of influence in the workplace. The people who have the greatest influence are the managers, the line managers. So line managers need to be absolutely involved in learning in the workplace. And you see the quote here, people reporting to managers who are focused and effective at developing their teams, those teams outperform others by around about 25 to 27%. Now, I was involved in the research that produced this data with the Corporate Executive Board some years ago, and I always like to express it in this way. How would you like everyone in your organization to do 1 day's extra work a week? It doesn't require them to come into work on Saturdays or the extra day of work. It doesn't require more cost. It simply requires us to get managers to understand their role in terms of supporting and helping learning. And there's been a lot of research going right back to people like Mary Broad and John Newstrom, who published a book back in the 1990s that showed that what the manager does before a formal training program and what the manager does after the training program are the most influential factors in ensuring that that learning is transferred into new practice. So I think we all know that. So that principle is really important, that we need to focus on learning as part of working, but also we need to make sure that our managers, the people with responsibility for teams, have an understanding and they don't try and trade off what I call trading off operational excellence. In other words, I'm focused, as a manager, I'm focused on hitting my targets and making sure I deliver on my objectives. I don't have time to focus on developing my people. The answer is, that's a false trade-off. Any good people manager will focus on developing their people. That's strategic, because if you focus on developing your people, they will deliver more for you, they will stay with you longer, and so on and so forth. So that's really critical. If I can move this on. Thank you. Then thinking about some misconceptions in terms of 70-20-10. First of all, 70-20-10 isn't what we call 10 plus. In other words, if we develop some structured learning and add some social learning to it, and maybe add some structured activities for people to do carry out in the workplace, that's what I would call really good learning, really good formal learning, really good 10. And you see this a lot, particularly in leadership and specifically in leadership programs and so on, where people, cohorts of people on leadership programs are expected to do things in the workplace. Of course they should be. Every learning program should be linked into what we do in the workplace. But it's not just by adding some 20 and some 70 to a formal program isn't really, it's what, as I say, it's 10 plus, it's good 10. It's not 70-20-10. So I guess that raises the question about how we learn and why do we learn. So what do we learn for? Do we learn because it's just a good thing to do? Or do we learn because we need to learn for other reasons? I mean, it's a basic human characteristic that we want to learn. Humans want to get better at doing things. It's a basic characteristic. But if we look at these factors here, so we learn and we provide learning for personal development. People want to get better. People want to progress their careers. We learn from personal satisfaction. We feel better when we know things. When we're successful, we feel better. Actually, successful people are much more engaged in organizations, but highly engaged people are not necessarily successful. So the whole model around focusing on engagement, hoping that it's going to improve in performance, I'm afraid the research tells you that's not the case. If you focus on helping people perform better, they will be more engaged. The research tells us that very clearly. And it's also, as I say, it's a human condition. We want to get better. If any of you know Daniel Pink, and Daniel Pink's great book called Drive, which is around what motivates people. What motivates people is autonomy, the desire to make our own decisions, mastery, the desire to get better at what we do, and purpose, which is that we are doing things that we believe in which are aligned with the purpose of our organization. So, but we also learn to contribute in order to contribute to organizational success. So learning isn't just something that we do just for ourselves. We have to think about it in terms of we're doing it for our organization's success as well. Because organizations where we create a culture of continuous improvement and a culture of learning are organizations that are more agile, they're more able to respond to change, they're more successful, people stay with those organizations longer. There are a whole range of different ways in which they are much more successful. So 70-20-10 focuses on co-creation, the fact that if we're looking at providing learning solutions, we should be doing this in collaboration and co-creating our solutions with our stakeholders. So working with those managers and those leaders, business leaders, so they understand that the solution that we're developing is partly their solutions, they have ownerships in it. So that's why whenever we're designing a formal learning program, we should never do it without making sure that the key stakeholders are engaged in the development of that. If we're going away into our little black box and producing an e-learning program without engaging the people who that's aimed at, we really are unlikely for it to be very successful, to be honest. And we see it often. You know, people have a training program and they come back a year later and say, can you run that program again? Because everyone thought it was great, but it hasn't really done much. And often the reason is there's no co-creation in there. And really it's around creating this organizational value. So, what ideas have you got that could, if you can think about some ideas around how we do create learning value, how we do learn. I know I've given you quite a few examples, but anything else specifically? Maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A. You can just bear with that in mind. Okay, let me tell you. We learn through challenging experiences. We learn through hard work. We learn through successes. We learn from working on projects that go really well and projects that don't go so well. We learn from challenging experiences. We learn from opportunities to practice. And again, working in the knowledge industry, those of us that work in knowledge industries, we often forget the importance of practice. If you go and talk to any elite sports people, they'll tell you that there is no possible way that they can maintain or build their level of performance and maintain it without continuous practice. And I think language learning is a really good example. How could you possibly be effective in a second or a third or a fourth language unless you practice again and again and again? And we were talking last night, and I was explaining my wife was born and brought up, she was born in Bolivia. She spent the first 6 years of her life in Bolivia. She was a fluent Spanish speaker. She now speaks no Spanish at all. Absolutely gone. Because she didn't practice, obviously. And we all know that. The more we practice, the better we get. The next factor around how we learn is, this is right at the limit of its, thank you, is we learn through conversations and networks. I work with a man called Jay Cross. I'll talk a little bit about him, but Jay referred to conversations as being the stem cells of learning. We learn through conversations. And Rob Cross, an academic in the US, has done a lot of work that demonstrates that people who have better networks, have more diverse and rich networks, are better performers. There's a lot of very clear evidence about the fact that we learn through networks and conversations. And lastly, we learn through reflection, through reflective practice. We learn by taking a little bit of time to think about how things went, what we do next time. And I'm often asked by people, or often people say, we don't have time to learn. And I think that indicates that their thinking about learning is about 10. We don't have time to follow a learning program. And the answer is, well, that may be the case, and we can work around helping that, but that doesn't mean we don't have time to learn, because keeping on the wine theme, I would suggest that tonight, everyone goes home tonight and pours themselves a glass of wine and sits down and ask yourself a couple of questions. You know, what have you heard today? What impact has that had on you? And what will that help you do maybe tomorrow? And that's a really important aspect of learning. That reflective practice is a really important aspect of learning. So that raises, I guess, the question around what what percentage of knowledge you actually need to hold in your head in order to do your jobs.
So that's the question for you. What would you think is the percentage that you need to have to be able to do your job? What is the knowledge you need to hold in your head? Have you got any ideas? Because we've got some answers to that. Would you like to show the answers? Because it's quite amazing in reality. So it shows that not that long ago, I mean in 1986, you needed to have 75% of the knowledge in your head to do your job. Whereas, I mean, 30 years later, it's 8 to 10%. We don't know how much it is today, but there's a big chance that that has decreased even more. So you realize with this that 10 is excellent and 10 is the basis, but it's only the basis. And that you need the 20 and that you need the 70 to be able to be effective and to perform in your job. It's not true, I think, of all jobs. I think that it's an average. I think that in some jobs you need more than that. But on average, some jobs you need less than that.
This data is interesting because Robert Keeley and his team at Carnegie Mellon University carried out this research. It was a longitudinal study. And if you think about in 1986, those of you that can think back to 1986, there was no internet. Well, there was an internet, but there was no really functioning internet outside of academic and military users. So the amount of information that we had access to was limited. Also, organizations were less complex. Each of us had fewer responsibilities. In fact, there's been an explosion in terms of objectives that people have in organizations. Back in 1986, most people would have had maybe 3 or 4 organizations had 3 or 4 objectives each year they aimed at, and people in those organizations had 3 or 4 objectives. By 2010, it was 23, 24 objectives. So there was increased complexity. We were asked to do more. There was a flood of information that we had access to, or that was thrown at us through a fire hose. So all sorts of things changed. So it's not surprising that you actually don't need to hold so much in your head, because it's around access. But underneath that access, there's some fundamental core capabilities and skills you need to have. And I think to the extent that language learning is really critical. If you can't communicate, so you need to have good communication skills. That's an absolute given. But in terms of those high-level data, access to all that high-level information, we just find it. You know, we know the right person to ask, or we find it. It's really critical. And I think that to a certain extent, in my experience, a lot of learning and development is still about imparting knowledge to people. We'll give you a test, we'll test you beforehand, we'll give you a test, we'll test you afterwards, and we'll check to see how much knowledge you've retained. That's actually a short-term memory test. And that's great, you know, it's good for short-term memory tests, but it's not really about learning, because learning is about behavior change. So are we providing you with the right information at the right time to help you to perform differently, in other words, to behave differently? That's what learning is all about. And I mentioned this man to you, Jay Cross. Now, some of you, I see Jerome Wagner nodding in the background. Jerome, you knew Jay Cross. Jay Cross was a wonderful evangelist and visionary American who wrote this great book on informal learning about exploiting the natural pathways to innovation and performance. And Jay made this quote here: "Formal learning is like riding a bus. The driver decides where you're going. The passengers are just along for the ride. Informal learning is like riding a bicycle or a bike. You know, the rider chooses the destination, the speed, and the route. And so I think 70-20-10 helps us think outside of that bus metaphor. We're not putting people into a program, through a program, and out of a program. We're thinking about how do we support people to do their jobs better, and sometimes it involves putting people into the bus, sometimes it involves providing people with support, and the resources that they need to do their jobs. Sometimes it involves creating the environment where people can learn from each other, or learn from have a mentor, or learn from an exemplary performer, from an expert. So all of those things are really critical. And so we have to step back and think about this as a system. How do we help the system improve? And the people are part of the system. So that's really critical in terms of doing that. So when we think about, go back and think about the manager dimensions around this, or the manager impact across these dimensions, I mentioned this piece of work that was carried out by the Centre for the Corporate Executive Board. And this piece of research showed that what the board did was they had 16 global organizations identify managers who were seen to be effective and focused at developing their people, and other managers who were seen to be not very effective and not focused at developing their people. And they gave the organizations various instruments. There was 360 feedbacks, anonymous feedbacks from the teams reporting into these managers and from the managers, and they looked at performance data, organizational performance data, so produced these cohorts. When the researchers analyzed this data, they found that those managers who are focused and effective at developing their people, those people outperform others by 25 to 27%. That's their day and a bit a week. But not just performance. Obviously, retention goes up, and we all know that. You know, there's a saying. I don't know whether it transfers into French, but in English, certainly in English, it's you join an organisation and you leave a manager, and that happens so often. You know, why do we leave managers? Why do we decide we want to move on? Often because our managers aren't focused on us. They're not focused on our development. So this bit of research verified that. 40% higher, less retention rate. Levels of satisfaction about the same, as you would expect. So people who work for managers who help them with their own development are much more satisfied, more likely to stay. And your organizational commitment is higher as well. So all of those factors are really significant. I mean, these are really, really significant figures. So if ever you're working with your managers who say, well, I don't have time for my teams, for my people to learn, that's your job as HR people or as learning and development people, the answer is it can't be. It has to be a joint enterprise here. Because if you leave it to learning and development and HR, they're not going to have this sort of influence. So we need to work in co-creation, and the methodology my colleagues and I at the 70-20 Institute developed around the methodology for what we call performance-based learning is absolutely built on co-creation. Co-creating with stakeholders, co-creating with managers, working really, really closely with people and understanding what tasks people need to carry out rather than what competencies they need to have. Competencies are a nice HR term. When we get down to looking at how work gets done, it's all about critical tasks and how we do the tasks. And we need to think about that as we develop our learning.
Charles and I are passionate about psychological safety. However, we don't have time to go into that today, so that's one of the slides that we're going to skip. But sure. If you want to talk to us about it afterwards, you're more than welcome.
Okay. So I think that's we've come to the end of what we wanted to present to you. So can we open up, David? Are you going to take questions? We have a bit of time for some questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And we have about 10 minutes for questions. So let's thank Charles and Lynne, and then we'll have some more questions. So one round of applause now. Actually, I thought that was going to take the 10 minutes, so that was really something. So we do have time for questions, though. Other follow-ups, questions that you want to ask, stories you want to tell about your own experiences, room for all of that. So, microphone, I'm going to bring my...
Because I wanted to show also the...
Hello? Does this 70-20-10% rule apply to all kinds of learning, or especially language, or the way to do things, or whatever?
That's a very good question. Think about it in terms of, it's difficult, don't think about it in terms of percentage. Think about it in terms of the fact that most learning occurs as part of working and practice. And that doesn't just apply to language learning, that's all learning. Now, certainly some types of learning, it's not 90% in the workplace, or 90% of part of working, and 10%. In other cases, it's more. So, but when you look at virtually every sort of learning, most learning occurs, if you want to build expertise, you will never build expertise by formal learning alone. And again, to use a language learning example, if you complete a language learning program, you will be maybe fluent, partly fluent, but if you want to become really fluent, you have to practice, you have to use it. So, it's a bit like, can you imagine let me come back. The very, very famous American psychologist, some of you may know, called Jerome Bruner. Jerome Bruner was probably the greatest educational psychologist, certainly of my life. Jerome Bruner once asked the question, what's the difference between learning physics and being a physicist? And his answer was that you learn physics, I get the certificate, I've got my degree in physics. Doesn't make me a physicist. What makes me a physicist is, Bruner said, by being inculcated into the culture of my profession. I become a physicist by doing physics, by working, by being in a community and learning from my colleagues and working on projects. So I get my degree, that gives me the certificate which enables me to become a physicist. So actually it really doesn't matter, and you could change physicist to any job, any role you like. What's the difference between learning accountancy and becoming an accountant? What's the difference between learning medicine and becoming a surgeon? What's the difference between learning engineering and becoming an engineer? It's exactly the same. Yeah.
And in languages, it's especially true when you can learn a language and you can read a book, right? You can go to school and you can read a text and you can understand what's written. However, if you try to talk, if you haven't had the experience of talking, if you haven't had the experience of actually oralizing the language, then you won't be able to. And so that's why the experience also is especially important in language learning. And you can know it and go to another country and not understand it. English, if you go to Ireland, if you haven't practiced it in Ireland, it might be a little bit challenging. Yes, please.
Next question, I promised over here. Okay.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for your sharing. I represent a business school, and I really want to understand how you figure out the application of your model in the academic field. I mean, for students. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I think let me just reflect your question to make sure I've understood it. How it can be applied in the academic field. Yeah, absolutely. I think very easily. It's around how do you integrate. I would say the academic field should be aiming to produce that 10+. In other words, how can you make sure that you're integrating the working and the learning through others with the 10? And I've seen this. I think that we're seeing changes occur in academic field. I can just talk. I was a business school professor, so I can talk from an MBA and a business education perspective. I've worked a little bit with a man called Henry Mintzberg, and who's a Canadian academic who's very critical of the traditional method of MBA teaching by the Harvard case model. Because Harvard case model assumes that we can throw you a challenge, you can go and overnight working with 2 or 3 people, you can solve big complex business problems. And of course we know you don't solve complex problems overnight. They take time to work. So I think that in answer to your question, using 70-20-10 mindset and the methodology within formal education, you can take that and think, how much information do we need to impart? What level of capability do we need people to get through in a structured way in order for them to be able to exploit the learning through work and the learning with others? And think of it with that holistic, systemic approach. And I think that's, for me, my message would be, think systemically. Think about, what are we trying to change? What are we trying to help these people do? And how can we integrate our formal programmatic learning, our formal structured learning with what they're going to do? And it comes back to context, because the best learning is all about context, and learning is all about context. So how can we create that? It's difficult. It's not as easy as just creating a big program and throwing it out and putting people through it, you know, but it'll be far more effective if you think about how we integrate that learning through working and that learning from working. And there's a model that I wrote a book with 2 colleagues about this, called 70-20-10 towards 100% performance. Don't buy it unless you really want to get into it. It's a very technical book. But one of the things we talked about there was adding learning to work, which is what we're doing there, embedding learning in work, and extracting learning from work. So we have to think about all those elements as we're developing.
David, there was a question behind you, 3rd row, pink t-shirt.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting sharing with us. I have a question because I work for an organization, a company, Bureau Veritas, where we have started talking more and more about 70-20-10. And I wanted to ask you whether you have some good practices of how to embed this in the company culture, and especially towards manager, because I think it's, you talked a lot about how they are critical, but how themselves can we train them, and how can we percolate this?
I think your question is, how do we do it? Any examples?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we could. We don't have time, but we could talk about a number of cases. What I'd recommend, if you want to do that, if you go to the 70-20-10 Institute website, which is just 70-20-10institute.com, you'll find on that site there's a number of case studies. And there's one case study I'd recommend you and you can just freely download them. There's one case study there from Citibank, the big American bank, and it's called From Courses to Campaigns. And we work with Citibank to actually do that, to embed that and change the culture in an organization with 180,000 people. And a man called Brian Murphy and I, and Brian was the head of performance and learning at Citibank, he and I wrote a paper, and you can download that paper and free to use it. And actually, if you're there, you can see some other cases as well, but that's the one that will really give you a good insight.
Charles, with your permission, I'd just like to add to your answer. I'm British, as you know. Do you know what we eat for breakfast in England? Eggs and bacon. La poule, elle contribue. Le cochon, il est impliqué. The chicken, yeah, right. So I had to get the managers in my learning projects to stop being chickens and start being pigs. So I have invented a chicken-pig conversion machine. And it's a workshop where I do exactly what Charles recommends. I take the job holders, the training manager, and the shareholders, of the business shareholders, and I have them visualize the value chain that we're trying to impact by the training, okay? We do it on a board, and we vote on it, and we work out what are the most important competencies and so forth, and we work out what are the key performance indicators. And it's a workshop that fidelizes your business owners, and then they know what they're going to measure. And I discovered that rather than having fantastic content or technology, the most important arm I had in my weaponry was getting the managers to be seen to be measuring the progress of the students. Because what you measure is what you get. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. You want to add anything to add? Because I think we're just about at the end of the time. Thank you so much, Charles and Lynne. That was terrific. One more round of applause for Charles and Lynne.